we're very excited to be welcoming Aaliyah Bilal. Bilal was born a stone's throw away in Prince George's County, Maryland. She has degrees from Oberlin College and the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies. She's published stories and essays with the Michigan Quarterly Review and the Rumpus, focusing on Black American Muslim experience and stories that connect Chinese and Afro-diasporic peoples. Temple Folk is her first short story collection in which Black Muslims contemplate the convictions of their race, religion, economics, politics, and sexuality in America. So please join me in welcoming Aaliyah Bilal.
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum if you partake. So my name is Aaliyah Bilal, and I am the author of Temple Folk. I am incredibly honored to be with you this evening, to be in or near my hometown. I tend to claim DC, but I know how you DC people are. You're very, very particular about who counts as a DC person. So again, I'm just very honored to be with you, and grateful that you again came out to spend your evening with me. You could be watching Barbie and you're listening to short stories. So I want to give a shout out to someone who's very, very important to me, who happens to be here this evening. Ethelbert Miller, who is one of my heroes. I have known Ethelbert Miller not quite 10 years, but back in, I think it was 2013, 2014, I was interested in making a documentary about go-go music. I'm very, very passionate about go-go culture. I love go-go music. And he gave me an audience. He invited me to his home and welcomed lots of other artists to spend time with me. And I was this complete unknown to him, but he still did that for me and has just been a wonderful support to me through so many of my life's ups and downs. He is a hero to literature. He's a hero to this city, and he's my personal hero. And so I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for everything that you mean to me. Ethelbert, thank you. And some of my family are here. We are DC people, the Bilal family. I see your faces. I love my family. I am very, very proud to be a Bilal, and so honored that you guys came out to see me tonight too. So I did something that I was told never to do as a first-time writer, as a first-time author. And I looked up some of my online reviews. Now I understand why they tell you not to do that. And one of the gentlemen that wrote a review, he said some nice things. He said some critical things too, which is totally fine. I'm for that. And one of the things that he pointed out about the book is that he didn't know who this messenger guy was that I kept referring to in the book. Who's the messenger? I mean, she keeps talking about the messenger, and I don't know who this guy is. And it made it clear to me that maybe people are encountering these stories just as stories about Black Muslims in this vague sort of way. Black person, hijab equals Muslim, right? However, it may not be clear to some people that Temple Folk is chronicling a very specific history and a specific lineage of Black Muslim experience. You know, it'd be a very different book if I were talking about Somali Muslims in, let's say, St. Paul, Minnesota, or Ethiopian Muslims in Seattle, Washington, or even in Washington, D.C. There's a very, very large population, as we all know, here. But this book is about African American Muslims who came into Islam by way of the Nation of Islam. And so because there's no interlocutors tonight, I just thought it would be kind of helpful maybe if I went through some of that history with you before I do a little bit of reading. And please keep in mind, I am a fiction writer trying to convey this history, so it may sound a little funny to you, but just roll with me. When we think about the way that the Nation of Islam comes into being, there are a couple of points of entry. And one important way to understand the emergence of the Nation of Islam is to think about the movement of African American people out of the agrarian South in the early part of the 20th century, flooding into northern cities, particularly Detroit, in the 1910s to feed the wartime industries that were in need of black labor. As time goes on, of course, 1929 hits, we get the Great Depression, black people are out of work, and then this racial utopia many people were hoping they would find in the northern cities, they don't ultimately find. And so there's economic tension and racial tension. Enter Fard Muhammad. Fard Muhammad is a person of uncertain origin, so very likely he's from British India. And he is attached to a very important movement, the Ahmadiyya movement, which emerges in British India in the late 19th century. And in the 20th century, the Ahmadiyya movement becomes the most prominent, you could say, missionary movement within Islam globally. And before the Nation of Islam comes into prominence in the 1950s, it is the largest group. It represents the largest group of African American Muslims in the United States, again, before the emergence of, or the growth of the Nation of Islam in the 1950s. And so Fard comes to Detroit, and he teaches this very specific version of Islam. And right now, I'll take a few minutes just to talk a little bit about the Nation of Islam and their very, very unique cosmogony. So the Nation of Islam's teachings are quite distinct from what we would refer to as normative Islam, the form of Islam that 87 to 90% of Muslims in the world practice, which is Sunni orthodoxy. All right, are you ready? In the Nation of Islam cosmogony, they place the origins of our universe back in the trillions of years. If I'm not mistaken, around 76 trillion years ago, the universe comes into existence. And after the birth of the universe comes the earth. And then from the earth comes Allah, the black man. With the emergence of Allah, the black man, he creates the stars and the planets and our sun. And after he's made his creation, he sets about populating the earth. And the first kind of person that is created is what's called the original man, the original black man. Much, much later in this version of history, a time of trouble overcomes the earth, and a man by the name of Yaqub, the big-headed scientist, is born outside of Mecca. And Yaqub is a brilliant man, but an evil man. And one day he performs an experiment where he takes two magnets and realizes how they attract each other, and comes up with this idea that he wants to create a new kind of human being that will oppose the original man. And so over 600 years on a faraway island in the Aegean Sea, he creates the white man. And this, in a nutshell, is how the Nation of Islam, or at least Fard Muhammad, explains the seemingly eternal contest between black and white in our world. So Fard Muhammad teaches this version of Islam, and then he disappears in 1934. After a big contest, a man emerges as the leader of the Nation of Islam, born Elijah Poole, turned Elijah Kareem, and ultimately assuming the name Elijah Muhammad. So Elijah Muhammad is the messenger. Fard Muhammad is the master. In case it's not clear to people who are encountering this book, these are the figures that I'm talking about. So in 1943, Elijah Muhammad is sent to prison in Milan, Michigan, which is just south of Ann Arbor, for a draft evasion. And he's only released from prison in 1946. Bless you. He's only released from prison in 1946. And at this point, we see the dawn of the second phase in the history of the Nation of Islam, which is referred to in the book as the first resurrection. So that makes sense, right? The organization goes dormant when Elijah Muhammad goes to prison, not completely dormant. There were maybe dozens of members who remained active. But it was during this first resurrection period that we start to see this exponential growth in interest and participation in the Nation of Islam, owing to lots of historical factors that are probably obvious to you. So in the 1950s specifically, we see these social advances for black people and the opposition to those advancements. You get the White Citizens Council, and you see the death of Emmett Till, you see the church bombings in Birmingham, Alabama. So this resistance to black progress helps to grow interest in the Nation of Islam, in addition to the coming into prominence of Malcolm X in the 1950s. So the first resurrection does not end until 1975, when Elijah Muhammad, or the messenger, dies, at which point his son, Warthi Muhammad, assumes the reins of leadership and becomes, or takes the organization in the direction of Sunni orthodoxy. And so this is the period of history that Temple Folk is concerned with. We're looking at Sunni Orthodox Muslims who were once part of the first resurrection experience, looking back on those experiences, reevaluating their memories of those experiences, and then their children who only know Sunni Orthodoxy, thinking about how they relate to their faith. And so we see these people moving through a religious tradition, or several religious traditions, coming into a more authentic and personalized sense of what spirituality means to them. And so I hope that this book can be understood within that historical context. So hopefully that was thorough enough of an explanation. And now I would like to read a little bit of Temple Folk for you. I guess we'll see what you guys think if you want me to continue. But, you know, something I'm realizing as well as I am sharing Temple Folk is that people, they get really scared when you tell them that you've written a work of fiction about the Nation of Islam. Because I think they think, well, maybe she hates me. Maybe she's got these really strident notions about these people of this race are good, these people of that race are bad. No, I'm a fiction writer, and I will write whatever it is that I want to write. I wanted to write about the Nation of Islam, and that's that. But another thing that I realize is, like, people don't realize how fun and funny this world is as well. And one of the ways to cut through that narrative that equates, like, the Nation of Islam with hate is to introduce some humor. And that's something I try to do in this book. It's up to you whether or not I succeed at And so what I like to do right now is to read a passage of a short story called Nikah. There is a little bit of adult stuff here. I'm so sorry if there are children present. But it's not too bad. Okay, so this is the opening of Nikah. On her first and last courtship outing with brother Salahuddin Mubarak, Qadira sat looking from him back to the timepiece in her lap. Pardon me. Counting the minutes until she could finally leave. The evening started off well enough. He chose the Kandahar, an Afghani restaurant in the heart of the city, a place with soft music, low lights, and cloth napkins arranged like fans inside all of the water goblets. Much nicer than the greasy spoon Khalil, the miserly personal injury lawyer, had taken her to a few weeks earlier. On her arrival, Salahuddin, a tall, rotund man with a bright smile and a prodigious but well-kept beard, presented her with a bouquet of pink carnations and held the door as they entered from the waiting lounge. The rest was all downhill. She barely uttered a word all evening as he dominated the conversation, moving from topic to topic with the bewildering speed of a marble knocking about the insides of a pinball machine. She was particularly alarmed as he carried on, complaining about all the crazy women he'd met of late. After more than a year of searching for an ideal mate, he bore the aura of a man who was embittered by the effort. The women he'd met thus far, he said, had standards that were plainly un-Islamic and too heavily influenced by the dictates of the world. Y'all be wanting a man to give you material things, not looking at a brother for his development, trying to see where he's headed. A lot of y'all are living for the dunya more than the promise of the hereafter. If you're trying to live that dunya life, better have your own dunya cash. Am I wrong? He asked, and Qadira shook her head. It was merely convenient that it appeared like she was agreeing with him, the gesture hiding her certainty that he was not the kind of man that was suited to be her husband. He had a respectable job, working full-time at a mall kiosk, selling prepaid cell phones and other small electronics. And in his earnest preparations to become a husband, he started a side hustle, as he called it, selling incense and oils. The waiter, Kamyar, a tall man with a Freddie Mercury mustache and a permanent, curious grin, stood above them, scooping the leftover saffron rice and kofta chalao into styrofoam containers as Salahuddin twirled a miswak stick over his molars, going into detail about his foray into the industry. He only started the gig a few months earlier, and in that short time had gotten his sales strategy down to a science. I load up the bike with my briefcase and fill it up with product, then head from all the barbershops to all the beauty salons in a 20-mile range of the east side. If I'm on my game, he said, I can make $300 a day. Total that up with what I make at the shop. That's a life right there, sister. She enjoyed his descriptions of the fragrances, the talk of patchouli, of cinnamon and amber notes. But it was his incuriosity about her perspectives that had tipped the scales. He'd shared so much, yet seemed to pay so little attention to Qadira, much less the matter of their compatibility. How could he gather whether or not she really was about the dunya life? She wasn't. Or if she liked the smell of nagchampa that he claimed was the best scent ever created by man. So as you can see, I'm getting myself together. The only thing I'm missing is my own little lady. Somebody to take my house and make it a home. And what say you, Miss Qadira? You trying to get married? Before you answer, he added, I got you a little something special. Salahuddin pulled the miswak stick from his mouth, a speck of minty saliva landing in her right eye. As he went into his satchel, from the zipper cavity, he removed 2 vials of perfume, both amber glass, tall and skinny with rollerball applicators. He placed them on the table before her, one at a time, and with her good eye, she read the names. Oud Swag was the first. "But this one right here is my bestseller," he said. "It will get you all the way right." She made an alarmed expression as she examined the label of the second vial. "A seductive blend for intimate moments," read the caption that was printed under the name Bump and Grind Satin Panty Dropper. "Oh my," she said. "Thank you so much. What a thoughtful gesture." She said it through a forced smile. And Salahuddin nodded with pride, looking into her eyes like he saw his future there, like he was certain that in his eyes she saw the same. So that's that part of the story. Thank you. I don't know if you know this world, but if you've been to like a Korean beauty supply store, like these oil names, these oil fragrances have some scandalous names. They have scandalous names. And I think I put myself in the situation where like somebody compliments me on my fragrance and I'm having to tell them, "Oh girl, you know I'm wearing that Bump and Grind. You need to get you some Bump and Grind." Guys, come on, let's come up with some new names for these fragrances. I apologize again for all of the children present. Shall I read one more passage before we open it up to questions? Okay, so this story that I will read from is the opening of The Spider, which is voiced by a man. I'll do my best. And yeah, I hope you like it. The Spider. It was Brother Latif who decided to convene the purchasing committee's second quarterly meeting at the Best Western downtown. He talked about the merits, saying that we, as a group of men trying to improve our business prospects, would never get very far until we started looking the part. The others quickly agreed, as they were, generally speaking, awed by every word that fell out of his mouth. He was a gruff figure in the days of Malcolm and the First Resurrection, one of the messenger's most formidable goons, and carried out of it the same fearsome profile he honed in the nation. Since it all fell apart, he transformed himself into a textile merchant and found some success selling members-only jackets in the dying days of disco. He drove a long, shiny Buick and had a house in a rich suburb, which was sufficient to earn the respect of the men in our collective. They didn't seem to share my suspicion that his holdings were exaggerated, and most likely, Brother Latif was a man living dangerously outside his means. But I was never the type to talk in whispers and didn't want to be accused of starting a fitna. So I went with the flow, satisfied at the very least that he had the assent of the majority. The first thing I noticed was how drab the room appeared from the inside. It was small and dark, with composite wood paneling on the walls and a single fluorescent light that buzzed every odd second. The men who arrived before me sat around 3 skirted tables in a U formation that ran the length of the room. The smallest table was at the front, dressed with a tiny microphone stand and a brown glass vase with a single plastic rose dangling over the lip. A large painting hung prominently on the wall behind it that disturbed me to view, though I couldn't pull my eyes away from it for longer than a few seconds. It was one of those corporate monstrosities, chaotic in effect, like the thoughtless finger paintings of a small child. The thing looked like it was made with grenadine, melted chocolate, and a smattering of contempt for all the normal people that don't have patience to try and understand this shit. The hotel staff placed a pitcher of water on each table next to a small stack of translucent cups. I couldn't help but shake my head at that. We would have been better off, I figured, taking Imam Salim's suggestion and just staying put at the temple. The kitchen sisters would have at least given us some fruit punch and sugar cookies. Hell, had we asked nice enough, they might have made us some fried chicken and potato salad. If we were trying to throw money around like Rockefellers, why not put it in the building fund or pay zakat? But I was a one-man HVAC operation with little more than a truck, some tools, and a house I was just 3 mortgage payments away from owning outright. As far as those brothers were concerned, I was too ordinary, based on outward appearances, to be an example. When I entered the room, I fell into a lively conversation that I could hear all the way out in the hotel lobby. The brothers were in an uproar over something that had unfolded a couple of nights prior. And that was on the lips of all the temple folks in the hours hence. I learned about it in real time, watching the 10 o'clock news, sitting on my living room couch, drinking the ginger beer my wife Sadaka had pulled out of the fridge for me. At the tail end of the broadcast, the TV voices went from monotone to bright as the state lotto flashed sparkly colors across the screen, ready to call the day's numbers. Instead of 1,000 balls tumbling inside a clear plastic globe, there was a live action shot of a small camera crew approaching a house I instantly recognized as Qasim Abdurrahman's, a taxi cab driver, long-standing member of our committee, and Brother Latif's number 2 in command. A woman in a long red evening gown looking like Veronica Lake stood beside a man in a tuxedo who knocked on the door. Qasim opened it, sure enough, clad in a black kufi and a long black thobe, having most likely just finished up his nightly Quranic recitation. His jaw was tight, eyes bulging with anger. I'm sure he thought it was a couple of the local hoods looking for late-night kicks at his expense. Qasim's grimace sent a flash of terror through the announcer's body, though he quickly regained his composure. "Are you Mr. Abdurrahman?" he said with radio verve. Qasim looked back at his wife and 2 daughters. The camera poked into the living room, showing the women all seated together on the couch, hijab down like a gaggle of nuns. He returned his alarmed gaze back to the camera. "Yeah, that's me," he said. "Something I can help you with?" "Congratulations!" The suited man's voice bore the sing-song cadence of Ed McMahon. "You didn't just hit the right number, my friend. Today you struck gold." The woman in the red gown simpered as she handed Qasim an oversized check with the words $1 million typed in big, bold print across the front. Brother Suleiman reenacted Qasim's shock, the way it morphed into elation as the news registered across his face. Everybody laughed at that, and so did I, happy for the moment to be thinking about something other than this ugly-ass room and the fact that there were no decent refreshments on hand, not no Nilla wafers or nothing. Then he had the nerve to look right in the camera like a deer in headlights, Suleiman squealed. That's when it had to cross his mind that all of us was watching. Just goes to show, it's always the holiest of holies out here backsliding on the low, violating the commands of God. Then Suleiman pointed at Qasim's closest ally in the room, the only one among us who wasn't amused. "Nah, Brother Larry, how does it feel knowing that your home skillet ain't nothing but a low-down gambling kafir?" Thank you. Everybody catches the drift of that. Like, Muslims aren't supposed to gamble. And then you've got this guy who gets caught gambling on like TV. It just seemed kind of like a funny setup to me, at least. So yeah, that's really all I had to share. I'm happy to take your questions if you have any.
First of all, Aaliyah, congratulations.
Thank you.
And I love the book. I'm not finished reading it, but I'm definitely going to finish reading it. I'm excited any moment I have to read it. One of the things I really liked about the book is that I am from the community of Wafdi Muhammad, and I study him. And one thing that was very interesting that I appreciated is we have a way of mixing just regular spoken street English with Arabic. And it's very strange to people. And we're so used to doing it that we think people know what we're talking about. And we've even changed the meaning of of the words. So I really appreciate the book because it's such a small community and people don't know about it. And I thought it was a really good way, a really easy read, a nice way to introduce the culture to people. And I have a 16-year-old daughter. So as you know, as a Muslim in this generation, trying to show her, what came before. A lot of it has turned into sarcasm because, like you said about humor, but there are things we look back at the past generation and we're like, what was that? And then it turns into jokes. But I thought you did an excellent job of putting it together. It was very respectful and tasteful, but it introduced these things in a way that you could receive it. Like even with Nora, it's one of the books on my study list for her, just to give her an idea, of what came before that she can understand because it's so light, and easy. But thank you so much for writing the book.
Oh, thank you for that comment. I thank you so much. I wanted to write a book that would make my family proud, that would make my community proud. But at the same time, I wanted to write a book where I wasn't shying away from hard topics. And, that was very important to me, is balancing those interests of not wanting to create stereotypical depictions of Black Muslims, but also to talk about some of the hard things there are to talk about when it comes to our experience. And it's my pride to write work that is pleasant to read, that can be read with ease, and that is satisfying on the level of ideas. And so I'm really grateful to know that you enjoyed this book. As far as interjecting Arabic words into the book, I did it in a way that I hoped wouldn't be onerous on the reader, where there's just enough there that, occasionally you have to look up a term. But once you've done that work, it makes you fluent in this culture in a sense, because this is the way that we talk in our communities. And I don't know how people are understanding half of the good hip hop in our culture if you don't know these words, because they are ubiquitous in hip hop, So I think this book is hopefully a primer not only to this community, but a primer to a deeper understanding of a lot of the good hip hop music that's being produced in our culture. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your reading. And I just sort of happened upon this evening, and I'm so glad I could make it. And I look forward to reading your book. I'm just wondering, in terms of the different takes on this in this culture from city to city, I know from generation to generation, but also, is that in the book as well, or did you do research on that, kind of anthropological, or is your family exposed to different sort of subcultures in the same era, or is this irrelevant?
No, so my family does come through this history, and this is part of why I was interested in writing this book. My grandfather converted to the Nation of Islam in the late 1950s, if I'm not mistaken, and raised my father and his siblings in the Nation of Islam. They left the community in 1975 and became Sunni Orthodox Muslims when, again, Wafdi Muhammad made that transition. And so I was born in the 80s, so I was raised Sunni Orthodox. But the atmosphere in my childhood was one that was filled with all of these reflections about the old days, the way things used to be, the good things and the bad things that happened to my family. And I just became very, very curious about that world. So I didn't really do any research aside from just listening to my family talk about those experiences. And all of that just came together for me. And I wrote Temple Folk. Yeah. As far as regional differences, I've been asking myself that question, like what are the significant regional differences when we think about African American Muslims who are part of this historical lineage? And I have a really hard time placing them. I mean, I think there are some, for instance, like in New York City, women wear the khimar, and so they have a very unique way of tying their hijabs. Here in Washington, D.C., I grew up tying my scarf in like a little knot behind my head. Just imagine the hairstyle that I have now, but it's all just like a head wrap. Like these are some regional differences. There might be some culinary differences from region to region as well, but it's quite uniform. I would say it's quite uniform throughout the United States. What happens, though, is that after this transition to Sunni orthodoxy, there is a further splintering that's happening where certain African American Muslims are very content in this community that Warthi Muhammad creates, and then others don't feel that it is true enough to Islamic orthodoxy, and so they veer further toward immigrant Muslim spaces. And so like there's a kind of splintering that's happening. But I also want to be clear, like this is not the only African American Muslim tradition that we can talk about. It's the one I'm focused on in this book. But there are the Ahmadiyya Muslims. A lot of the jazz musicians in our culture are affiliated with Ahmadiyya. Dizzy Gillespie, Ahmad Jamal, John Coltrane, and so when they talk about Islam, that's the version of Islam that they are referring to. So yeah, it's like a big, big world, but I'm just focused on this little slice of it. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Perfectly hidden behind the wall. So anyway, my name's Jimmy Williams. I'm with the Washington Literacy Center, so we're glad to have you here. I'm also from Chicago, so a lot of what you said resonated given the predominance of Black Muslims in Chicago, Illinois. One of the things that I was going to ask you, because I think regardless of religion, what you seem to hit upon is all those, what I call quiddities in the book, the hypocrisy, the irony of people who present themselves one way, but then everyday life and reality gets in the way. Were there specific influences, or were some of these things bits and pieces that you saw and experienced?
Absolutely.
Look, didn't want to put you on the spot.
No, it's okay. I want to be very clear that nothing in this book comes from real life. It is completely imagined. I would never, certainly not without permission, write about real people's experiences. I have not written about my family or anybody that I know. I have used some friends' names. Just I thought they would like the shout out. But nothing is taken from my life, but the themes of experience certainly are things that I observed and that many of my peers would say they have observed in our communities. But I don't think that's specific to Islam or this religious experience. I think personality and temperament are primary in the way that I conceive of the self. And religion is like, how do I say this? It wraps itself, it tries to wrap itself around the person like a girdle, like in a way to sort of shape action. But personality is always trying to assert itself, to be itself in a way that can be in opposition to religion. And so people are in religious spaces, whether they're Muslim, Baha'i, Christian, or what have you, are going to be themselves, whatever they say they believe. And that's what makes storytelling interesting. I mean, I don't think perhaps there's an interesting way to talk about Muslims like adhering to the fiqh and 100% adhering to the Islamic law, and like maybe there's a cool way to tell that story. I just think it's more interesting to see people like living alongside these beliefs but being themselves.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. And one other note, my niece who went to Oberlin just sent me a text because she saw it on our Twitter, and she said, "It's nice to see a black OB winning."
OB pride.
Yeah.
I'm very, very proud of that choice for an undergraduate institution. I'm very, very proud that I chose to become an OB. I see a couple of my OB friends in the audience tonight. I just love them. Looking back on it, I just love that environment. It was really good for awakening my sense of social consciousness and just trying to open myself up to the beauty of our differences across, a spectrum of human experiences. It was a beautiful place to get an education.
So I'm Ellen. I actually communicated with you through Ethelbert after I listened to your book. I had to get a hold of the book after I heard Aaliyah and Ethelbert in conversation. Instantly, I could get it on Audible, and I was just riveted for about 2.5 days because I couldn't let go of the book. First of all, I mean, so many thank yous for the many perspectives that you have. You so lovingly and so dynamically have shared with those of us who are watching from the outside, especially as an older white woman during this insane era that that my lifetime has been. There's so many terrible misunderstandings that need to be exploded, and you do it in such a exquisite and accessible and welcoming way. And I also was just struck by the language itself. And I guess that I would, it's just beautiful language. And not only the story's rich and complex, but the language you can take any one section and it just explodes. And it's a relatively brief book, but each of the stories are spoken with a different language and a different tone. So I'm kind of curious. No, Oberlin gets a lot of credit, I guess. Share with us a little bit about your unfolding as an artist and a writer and this gorgeous language that you've brought to us.
Thank you so much. I am, do I have permission to say this, a self-taught writer? I am someone that has just always loved beauty in all forms. But the way that I am able to capture that beauty is in language. I can harness it on the page. And, my development as a writer, I would attribute to certain social factors, just coming to grips with myself as someone that's really invested in the life of the mind. And all of these skill sets just started finding me. I just developed, I was in my late teens, early 20s when I realized beautiful sentences would just come to me. I would think of something and find a very poetic way to put it to myself, and it started coming as naturally as I could breathe. And I developed skill sets like this, and they sort of magnetized each other and came together into a writing persona, I guess you could say. I suppose, that's probably the way it happens for most writers. You just, life sort of pushed me in the direction of becoming a writer, and that's just what I am. I think that it's an inevitable consequence of the choices that I made, that I'd be a writer, which is to say that anybody can do this, making similar choices, just prioritizing the life of the mind and committing oneself to beauty and language. And thank you for the observations about the stories as well. I'm very, very committed to writing in a way that people can find themselves drawn to things that just on the surface they can't imagine themselves being interested in. Why would a Jewish man want to read about the Nation of Islam with all that we know to be true about the Nation of Islam? I just wanted to challenge myself to make that real, to make that possible, you know, that there was a way into this community that could feel warm and welcoming, but also critical. So.
I want to just add a note that actually Ethelbert asked you when he interviewed you. He made the observation about the name of the book, calling it Temple Folk, and how by calling it Temple Folk, the person who picks up the book, you know, across religions, we identify in being in temples. And it was really interesting when I was telling somebody about it, and said it was about the Black Muslim world and the Islamic world. They said, temple, that's not a Black Muslim thing. And so that was just a great example to me of the point I think that Ethelbert encouraged you to bring out about the title of the book. So you might want to add anything that you want to about the title of the book who didn't hear the conversation with them.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. In case you didn't hear, the question was about, you know, how we arrived at the title, the sense that temple, the term temple, doesn't really have anything to do with the Muslim experience. But in the Nation of Islam, these houses of worship are called temples. And so that's the connection there. But I specifically chose the term temple because it's vague and because just looking at the title, you don't really know who's being spoken about. You know, I have noticed that terms that point to Islam in our culture immediately elicit a certain kind of response that I didn't want the reader or the potential reader to be able to make when simply looking at this book. And the term folk is very significant to me as well. Someone a few weeks ago pointed out to me, said, temple folk, like church folk. And I thought, wow, that's interesting, because I never made that association myself. I chose the term folk because folk to me evokes this idea of belonging and authenticity. The folk. When we think of the folk, we think of Ma and Pa and somewhere maybe in the Midwest sitting on a porch. And I wanted to make like an aesthetic point with this book that while culturally distinct, these people in these stories very much belong to our country. These are American stories. So they are of the temple, but they are the folk. That is the real project of this book, is to make that aesthetic point, that you are reading stories about people who are your neighbors. They live among you, and their culture has rubbed off on you. In fact, you know, if you listen to hip hop, if you've ever had a bean pie, if you've ever enjoyed the poetry of Muhammad Ali, the rhetoric of Malcolm X, you are already a part of this world. And this book is just a way of becoming more familiar, of getting to know this world in a more three-dimensional way. Yeah, absolutely, no problem. I saw somebody and they suddenly disappeared.
Hi, Aaliyah. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank
I listened
you.
to it also, and it's amazing.
Thank you.
And there's some really humorous stories surrounding food throughout the book, and I was wondering if you could just speak about food throughout your short stories.
Food is such a huge part of, I'm sure, any culture, but it's such a huge part of Black Muslim culture. And one of the things that I relish about my childhood memories going to Masjid Muhammad here in Northwest DC were the opportunities to commune around the food that was prepared in the kitchen there. And my father, who's here, he did a lot of work in that kitchen, laying the tile floors and other things like that. The Shabazz Bakery, Champ Cookies. I mean, these are all big institutions in the Black Muslim community, Black Muslim communities around this country. So it factors hugely into the stories. But also, African American Muslim foodways mirror foodways in other kind of religious movements in the United States like the Seventh-day Adventists, who are trying to introduce a healthier lifestyle through food. And so African American Muslims are concerned with, eating foods that promote health. And so on that level as well, it was a big part of the conversation in our communities, a new way of relating to food that would help our people to survive in the wilderness of North America. So it's subversive, and it's a way that African American Muslims share love with each other. So yes, thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. Thank you.